By 1900, the gallery's collection had grown from its modest beginnings through the acquisition of the Angustin collection, the gifts and bequests of Beaumont, Turner, and Prince Albert, and paintings tirelessly pursued on the continent by eager directors, to a gallery that rivaled any of the great European museums. In addition, the move to Trafalgar Square and the building's expansion over the 19th century had provided the space to match this growing collection and the gallery's ambitions. By the midpoint in this new century, it would have faced and risen to the enormous challenges brought about by the Second World War. But as the 20th century dawned, the main challenge facing the gallery was competition in a burgeoning international art market and the rocketing costs of acquiring masterpieces for the national collection.
Holbein's The Ambassadors had been saved for the nation in 1890, thanks in part to the generous donations of 3 wealthy private individuals. Fearing the loss of other pictures overseas, the British decided to fight back, primarily against what art historian Sir Robert Witt called the multimillionaires of the New World. And so, in 1903, the National Art Collections Fund was established to lobby for funding on behalf of the nation's galleries.
The National Art Collections Fund, which still exists today as the Art Fund, was called on soon after its foundation to raise money to acquire Diego Velázquez's The Toilet of Venus. The painting had been put up for sale by John Morritt, on whose wall it hung at Rokeby Park, his house in Yorkshire. Hence its nickname, the Rokeby Venus. The fund had raised £15,000 of the £40,000 that was needed when, on the 24th of January 1906, King Edward VII came to review the picture and pledged £8,000 and a loan of a further £5,000, which effectively secured the painting.
The Rokeby Venus is a rare painting, the only surviving female nude by Diego Velázquez. It was also an uncommon representation in 17th century Spain, where sensual images were discouraged by the dominant Roman Catholic culture. Today, anyone can admire it in our public gallery, but during Velázquez's time, this painting would only have been seen by a very select audience in a private space. The composition is intriguing. It depicts a mythological scene, yet we may not recognise it as such until we notice the winged boy. The woman is Venus, the goddess of love, and she's shown lounging leisurely on her bed, resting on sumptuous blue fabric. Her figure, seen from the back, follows a sinuous line like a gentle wave moving across the canvas. Her naked body is modelled on the classical sculptures and speaks to a hyper-idealised female beauty. The winged boy is Cupid, her son, who represents the connection between beauty and love, the powerful force that unites pleasure and intimacy. His body is loosely painted, as if he is slightly out of focus. Velázquez has also blurred Venus's face reflected in the mirror. Her full beauty and her full identity remain concealed from us. Since it went on display in 1906, this rare and intriguing painting has inspired artists and writers, and featured in novels, films, and documentaries.
In 1909, Hans Holbein the Younger's Christina of Denmark, Duchess of Milan, a portrait commissioned by Henry VIII of a potential bride, was sold by the Duke of Norfolk to an art dealership for £61,000. A few days later, that same dealer offered it to the gallery for £72,000. Money was granted by the National Art Collections Fund towards its purchase, but on the 1st of June deadline, there was still a shortfall of £40,000. It seemed that nothing could stop the painting from going abroad, most probably to Henry Clay Frick, a fabulously wealthy and ambitious New York industrialist, financier, and art collector. But that afternoon, an English woman recuperating at a German spa resort telegraphed, I will make up deficiency for the Holbein. On hearing the good news, the gallery director, Charles Holroyd, is reported to have burst into tears. The painting was saved, but there was a caveat. The donor wished her name to remain forever a secret.
This sealed envelope contains the correspondence from the anonymous donor. To protect her identity, it is still kept by the Art Fund under lock and key. It is passed from chairman to chairman, unopened. And I'm sorry to say, although I've been asked to many times, that I will not be opening it now either.
At 10 o'clock on the morning of the 10th of March, 1914, just 8 years after the Rokeby Venus had been saved for the nation, Mary Richardson entered the National Gallery with a small cleaver up her sleeve. Richardson was a suffragette protesting the treatment of one of the movement's leaders, Emmeline Pankhurst, who was in jail at the time. Richardson recounted her story many years later.
Great many people in London went to see the Velasquez Venus, a new picture. I felt that the public should be notified of the iniquity being practiced on Mrs. Pankhurst. So I went to the gallery with my chopper. I found the picture had been heavily glazed for its protection. I got one of the detectives behind the newspaper and gave him a first wang on the picture.
Following the incident, the gallery closed its doors to the public. The damage to the painting by Richardson's attack was considerable, but conservators successfully repaired the 7 deep cuts to the canvas. The repairs are barely visible to the naked eye. In November 2023, the painting was again the target of a demonstration, this time by climate protesters. On this occasion, minimal damage was sustained to the painting beneath its protective glass.
When World War I broke out in July 1914, the gallery was still closed. It reopened the following month. In 1917, the most valuable paintings were evacuated to a disused London Underground platform at Aldwych train station to protect them from the threat of an aerial bombardment on London. In March 1918, German long-range guns were bombarding Paris when the personal art collection of the late painter, Edgar Degas, went on sale. At the auction house was National Gallery director Sir Charles Holmes. Dubbed the Cockney Gent, Holmes was the last director to date to be a practicing artist. A keen amateur boxer, he had published a book on trout fishing and the first monograph on hokusai in the English language. With him was John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who had played no small part in securing the Treasury grant of £20,000 Holmes had with him in French banknotes. Aware that the auctioneers would be reluctant to sell to a British bidder, Holmes was there incognito. He had shaved off his moustache and donned a pair of spectacles. As the shells fell, Holmes kept his identity hidden and successfully bid for 27 paintings and drawings, including Edouard Manet's The Execution of Maximilian. After a hazardous journey to Trafalgar Square, these works joined the burgeoning French 19th century collection. Holmes, meanwhile, returned the £8,000 he had not spent to the Treasury and regrew his moustache.
We are looking at Edouard Manet's The Execution of the Emperor Maximilian, a painting of 1867 showing the execution of the Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, an Austrian who had been propped up on the throne of Mexico by the French Emperor Napoleon III. The Mexicans rose against him, he was overthrown, and what we see here is the emperor being executed with 2 of his generals. He's holding their hands. We actually do not see Maximilian. The picture is now in fragments, and one of the parts we've lost actually shows Maximilian himself. The painting had been cut into fragments after the death of Manet. We're not sure why, but his great friend Edgar Degas went out into the streets of Paris, to the dealers of Paris, and reassembled what he could. He only found 4 pieces. They were highlights, however, of his own great art collection. These 4 fragments were always shown separately until in 1979, the artist trustee, Howard Hodgkin, insisted that they be returned to a single frame in the way that Degas had had them. That's why and how we see it in that way today.
Following the First World War, the gallery received an unexpected makeover, not on the walls, nor in the gallery spaces, but on the floor of the portico entrance. Between 1928 and 1952, the Russian-born artist Boris Anrep decorated the vestibules with 4 distinct, colourful mosaics: the labors of life, the pleasures of life, the awakening of the muses, and the modern virtues. The works take from the style of late antiquity, but Anrep often incorporated the likenesses of celebrities and members of high society of the time within his designs. In the classically inspired Awakening, Bacchus is modelled on the art critic Clive Bell, Clio is the writer Virginia Woolf, and Melpomene is a renowned actress Greta Garbo. In the Virtues, the poet T.S. Eliot appears in the cryptic panel Leisure, while the philosopher Bertrand Russell comes to represent lucidity. Elsewhere, there is even a small panel dedicated to mud pies. The final mosaic to be completed was the Modern Virtues. Within it, resisting a beast in Anrep's emblem of post-war defiance, is Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister during the Second World War.
The director who would see the gallery through the war was Kenneth Clark, appointed in 1934. Unusually, Clark was wealthier than some of his trustees. He was the heir to a textile fortune who had spent his childhood on yachts, and whose father had given him a hotel for a wedding present. The Earl of Crawford described Clark as a very arrogant little chap, but as clever as a monkey. He was certainly quick to experiment with new ideas. In 1934, he secured funding for a scientific advisor, Ian Rawlings, who established a physical laboratory that laid the foundation for the gallery's scientific department. Clark created activities specifically for children, including Christmas lectures, and he encouraged visitors to take a closer look at the collection through his book 100 Details from Pictures in the National Gallery. While innovative, he was a director who alienated many of his staff, who delighted in his missteps.
The Second World War may have saved Clark's directorship from infighting. In the 10 days leading up to the declaration of war on the 3rd of September 1939, with the bombing of London expected imminently, the gallery evacuated all of its paintings. The majority were distributed to locations in Wales, but in 1940 there was talk of shipping the collection to Canada, but instead Churchill instructed Kenneth Clark to hide them in caves and cellars, but not one picture shall leave this island. Destined to remain in Britain for the duration, a large, secure location was required for the collection. A disused slate mine near Blaenau Festiniog at Manod in Wales fitted the bill perfectly. 5,000 tons of rock was removed with explosives to enlarge the entrance and accommodate the biggest paintings. Narrow-gauge railway tracks were laid to transport the collection into the inner caverns. One was so large it was dubbed the Cathedral. 6 brick bungalows were constructed within these caves to protect the paintings from rockfall and variations in humidity and temperature. However, getting some of the largest works to Manod was not without challenges, in particular Van Dyck's equine portrait of Charles I.
Van Dyck's image of Charles I has really become the image of the king. Van Dyck's innovative approach was not only instrumental in projecting this all-powerful image of Charles I as a ruler, but it was also pivotal in the development of portrait painting in Britain. You'll notice that the king is small in stature and he has very lean legs. This is probably the result of him having suffered from rickets as a young child. However, the visible power and might of the horse on which he sits means that there is nothing weak about this painting. The horse is depicted as a wide-eyed beast with a frothing mouth and rippling muscles, but the king has him under control. Perhaps this is a metaphor of the king's control and governance over his kingdom and his subjects, or it may simply be a way to reinforce the king's own power. Rather appropriately, this painting hung at Hampton Court, and a composition such as this would have been at home in such a location, which is surrounded by woodland and which had been used for hunting for decades. Its sheer scale, which is over 3.5 meters high, means that it probably would have served a decorative purpose, a bit like a tapestry or a wall mural. And we think it's probably even inspired by contemporary set designs for theatrical performances at court, known as court masks.
In order to protect the painting during its move to the quarry, it was housed in an enormous triangular crate known as the elephant case. High winds en route made it vulnerable to toppling over. And at the low bridge near Blaenau Festiniog, even though the road had been hollowed out for the occasion, the case only just squeezed under the bridge. Rumour has it that air had to be let out of the tyres. By the summer of 1941, the whole collection had been reunited in its new subterranean home, leaving the gallery in London quite bare.
Kenneth Clarke's hope was to keep the empty gallery open for cultural pursuits rather than war ministry work. So when the famous pianist Myra Hess offered to arrange classical concerts in the gallery, he seized on the opportunity. Starved of entertainment, crowds flocked to Trafalgar Square for lunchtime recitals by some of the foremost musicians of the day, often Myra Hess herself. The aim was to make classical music accessible to all, and so the entrance fee was just 1 shilling. The lunchtime concerts were a huge success, even in the darkest days of the Blitz.
Audience members had been invited to bring their own food to these lunchtime concerts, but the rustling of sandwich papers threatened to drown out the music. And so a counter was built in the gallery's Tuscan room, where visitors could stand and eat their lunch as they listened. On the 2nd of November, 1939, a sandwich bar opened to the public. Inspired by the book Something New in Sandwiches, it was the brainchild of Lady Irene Gator. The sandwich bar was staffed by a team of formidable women, including the writer and actress Joyce Grenfell, who reported that favourites included honey and raisin in fresh brown bread, cream cheese and date, ham and chutney, and generous slices of good damp station cake. The counter was a hit, and in 1940 a canteen opened downstairs to provide hot meals for the war workers and members of the armed forces. A journalist reported at the time that from a cramped kitchen, Lady Gator's team, ably led by head cook Miss Geoffrey Poppy Kirk, previously an executive in a dressmaking house, served up to 2,200 meals a day until the 2 venues closed in July 1945.
While music and food were abundant, the walls of the gallery remained bare. In late 1941, with help from the National Art Collections Fund, the gallery acquired a new portrait of Margarita de Geer, probably by Rembrandt. A few days into the new year of 1942, the sculptor Charles Wheeler, later president of the Royal Academy, wrote to the Times newspaper to ask if the new acquisition and other works from the collection could be shown at the gallery, one at a time. The idea was put to the board and trustees. Kenneth Clarke, the gallery director, was in favour, noting that any attendant difficulties must be weighed against the delight and refreshment that the sight of a great picture would give. Soon, a list had been drawn up of paintings to bring back from the quarry at Manod in Wales. Every few weeks, a painting became the focus of a display, in what became known as the Picture of the Month scheme.
This portrait of Margaretha de Geer, which started Picture of the Month, is probably painted by Rembrandt. The gallery already had large-scale portraits that certainly were by Rembrandt, of both Margaretha de Geer and her husband, the wealthy merchant Jacob Tripp. The new acquisition, a smaller solo portrait of Margaretha, was painted with great skill at about the same time, in 1661. Technical examination discovered a number of peculiarities which seemed to set it apart from other works by the master. Some experts therefore think the painting may be a contemporary or slightly later version of an original by Rembrandt. Indeed, the brushwork is perhaps more fluid than we have come to expect from Rembrandt, for example in the swirls around the subject's mouth and at the sides of her nose. But the painting is of such high quality that it could equally be that it is an autograph painting by Rembrandt enjoying something of a technical holiday. Since the pictures are normally hung near one another at the gallery, visitors can compare the works and reach their own conclusion whether this instigator of Picture of the Month is truly a Rembrandt.
Responding to the Picture of the Month scheme, one art critic memorably called the National Gallery a defiant outpost of culture right in the middle of a bombed and shattered metropolis. The next painting to go on display was Titian's Noli Me Tangere in March 1942. In September 1943, 35,000 people came to see Velázquez's Rugby Venus. The arrival of each painting was a news event, and in all, 37 paintings were shown individually, some with accompanying minor works. Today, the gallery has an online Picture of the Month scheme, in which one work is chosen at a time for discussion on the gallery's website and across its social media channels.
Before the Second World War, temporary exhibitions in the gallery were almost non-existent. But in June 1940, the gallery held its first of many exhibitions showing the work of the WAAC, the War Artist Advisory Committee, much of it by the servicemen and women of the Allied cause. From February 1944 to May 1945, it was artists serving with the Royal Canadian Navy whose work was put on show.
On the ships that daily brave the perils of minefields and U-boats to bring their convoys safely to port are men of the Royal Canadian Navy. But these men are sailors with a difference. As well as being tough guys, they are war artists. Commander Beamont takes time off from action to make a rough note for a picture. This brush and these hands belong to Sub-Lieutenant Nichols, busy recording on canvas his impressions of a war scene. Commander Beamont translates those rough notes he made on board ship into terms of paint. And here is Lieutenant Wood at work. In Civvy Street, he, like many of his colleagues, was a commercial artist. The scene changes to the National Gallery in London, where the artists we have seen are exhibiting their work. There's something more interesting to the general public about the paintings here than at an ordinary art exhibition. Here they see the war through the eyes of men who know what it means.
There were also traditional art shows such as 19th century French paintings in 1942, while Design at Home in 1945 presented ideas for the perfect post-war home. Alongside the Picture of the Month scheme, these proved that the public had an appetite for temporary exhibitions that framed an interesting subject, as well as visiting a permanent collection of masterpieces.
Despite being hidden under 200 feet of rock, the gallery's permanent collection had fared well during the war. In fact, better than ever. Staff had been able to carefully control the humidity, light, and temperature in the brick storage huts to the benefit of the paintings, though there was still much to learn. As a result, a conservation department was set up within the gallery to complement the work of the scientific department, which was significantly expanded. These departments, with their roots in the 1930s and 40s, continue to play an essential role at the National Gallery in understanding the composition of the collection and conserving it for future generations to enjoy.
The bomb-damaged gallery was a sorry sight at the end of the war. The western side of the gallery was unstable. Many of the rooms had lost the glass in their roofs, now covered by corrugated iron. When the paintings, including the enormous equestrian portrait of Charles I, returned to the gallery, it was to an institution that had changed in many other ways. Above all, a new relationship had been forged with the public. The gallery was more than ever a public space, more egalitarian, and serving a multitude of functions. It was home to a growing team of scientific and conservation experts. It was an exhibition space, a space for music and events, a destination where refreshments accompany the joy of exploring artworks. A gallery that had proved its value and the value of art in the darkest hours. After many years of war, the paintings were back where they belonged. But peace would bring new challenges, not just about art, but about bricks and mortar, and about how the gallery should grow and develop.